The morning my backyard got invaded by a woman with a megaphone and a fake sense of government power, I learned something ugly about human nature. If you wear a bright vest, carry a clipboard, and speak like you've already won, a whole lot of people will hand you authority you never had. I was half awake, barefoot, skimming leaves out of my pool on a quiet Sunday, minding my own business, when my gate flew open so hard it smacked the fence and echoed across the patio like a gunshot. And before I could even fully turn around, this woman in mirrored sunglasses and a neon orange safety vest came marching into my yard like she was about to announce a natural disaster. I'm standing there in swim trunks holding a pool net, and she raises an actual megaphone 3 feet from my face, and blasts, "Attention, this pool is now under community control." Now, I don't know if you've ever been so confused your brain just kind of stalls out for a second, but that's where I was. I blinked at her, looked at the megaphone, looked at the vest, looked back at her and said, "Ma'am, you do not need that thing. I'm right here." She lowers it real slow like I'm the problem. Like I'm the one being unreasonable, and says in that calm, over-rehearsed voice people use when they want to sound important, "Sir, I am Diana Caldwell, newly appointed HOA president, and this property has been temporarily designated as a shared emergency resource." That's the moment the whole morning changed shape. Because it wasn't just the words, it was the confidence. She said it like a judge reading a sentence, like somewhere. There had been a meeting, some vote, some emergency declaration, and apparently everybody decided my backyard pool didn't belong to me anymore. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, more because it was so insane, my brain didn't know what else to do. I said, "You mean my pool? In my yard? Behind my locked gate?" She tilted her head with this fake little sympathetic smile, reached under her arm and pulled out a laminated paper. Laminated. That's how committed she was to the bit. She held it up and said, "Under Regional Water Preservation Directive 8B, all private water reserves exceeding 10,000 gallons must be made available for communal distribution during drought conditions." At first glance, it looked official enough to fool somebody in a hurry. Lots of bold text, a seal-looking thing in the corner language that sounded vaguely bureaucratic. But the longer I looked at it, the stranger it got. The formatting was off, the wording was vague, and I'm the kind of guy who actually reads city notices and county updates because I like knowing what rules are real and what rules are just somebody's wish list dressed up as law. I had never heard of anything like that in my life. Before I could say another word, more people started coming through the gate. And I mean just strolling in like my backyard had turned into a public park overnight. A guy in work boots dragging a hose, a couple carrying folding chairs like they were early for a tailgate, somebody wheeling a cooler across my patio, one kid, maybe 15, carrying empty gallon jugs with the kind of excitement teenagers only have when adults are doing something stupid enough to become a story later. I remember saying out loud, mostly to myself, "What in the world is happening right now?" Diana clapped once sharp and theatrical, then barked, "Team begin extraction." Extraction. Like my pool was a reservoir. Like we were mining the last clean water on Earth from some strategic location instead of draining a chlorinated backyard pool in a suburban neighborhood with functioning plumbing. The guy in boots started hooking up the hose. The teenager dropped to one knee by the deep end filling jugs. Somebody else began unloading blue plastic barrels from the bed of a pickup truck that had just backed halfway into my driveway. Diana was pacing around my patio, scanning the scene, jotting notes on her clipboard, speaking in this weird commander tone like she'd spent her whole life waiting for an audience. My neighbor Eric leaned over the fence with a coffee mug in his hand, squinting like he couldn't decide if he was watching a community event or a nervous breakdown. He called over, "You hosting some kind of pool party I didn't hear about?" I shook my head slowly and said, "Apparently I'm running a water distribution center now." Diana heard that. Of course she did. She pivoted on her heel, stepped toward me and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the water supply. Unauthorized proximity increases contamination risk." That one got a real laugh out of me. I said contamination risk from me in my own pool. And that's when I noticed the sign. They had zip-tied a bright red sign to my fence right beside the latch, bold block letters. "And all emergency water station authorized personnel only, penalty $500. I walked over and touched it just to prove to myself it was real, because surely nobody had actually trespassed into my yard, claimed my pool, and posted fake penalties on my fence before 9 in the morning. I turned back and said, "You put this on my property." She didn't blink. HOA Emergency Authority permits temporary requisition of private assets for community welfare. There it was. The word she loved most, authority. Not request, not discussion, not neighborly concern. Authority, that was the fuel. And the disturbing part was people were going along with it. Not because it made sense, but because she sounded certain. She looked official enough. She moved like she expected obedience, and most people will follow certainty long before they verify truth. That's just how we're built sometimes. The hose was running now. Containers were filling. Somebody was already talking about rationing. And standing there watching all of it, I realized this was not about water. Not really. My pool just happened to be visible, large, dramatic, useful as a symbol. Diana had just been elected HOA president a week earlier, and I'd bet every dollar in my wallet she was trying to prove something, maybe to the board, maybe to the neighborhood, maybe to herself. She wanted a victory, a display, a moment where everybody saw her taking charge. And she picked my backyard for the stage. So I stepped aside, pulled out my phone, and made one quiet call. I kept it simple. Hey, random question. Are residential pools part of any county emergency water distribution program right now? There was a pause on the line, then a voice that sounded genuinely baffled. No, sir. Absolutely not. Emergency supply comes from municipal reserves and authorized distribution points. Private pools are not part of any public program. That was all I needed, because now I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't reacting. I was observing. Once you know the whole thing is fake, the cracks start glowing. You notice the hesitation in people's faces, the way they keep looking at the person in charge to make sure they're still supposed to believe this, the way a fake system has to be constantly fed with confidence or it collapses. I could have started yelling, could have threatened to call the cops right there, shoved people out, turned it into a screaming match. But that would have played right into Diana's fantasy brave leader under attack, unreasonable homeowner, resisting the common good. No, I didn't want to fight. I wanted the script to break. So I raised my voice just enough and said, calm as can be. Hey, quick question for the team. That word team made a few people stop instantly. It made me sound like I was participating instead of resisting. The guy with the hose paused. The teenager looked up. Diana turned toward me, suspicious already. I smiled like I was helping and said, have we completed contamination testing on this water yet? Silence. Not dramatic movie silence. Worse. That awkward humankind where everybody suddenly feels the floor shift under them. Diana frowned. What? I walked toward the equipment shed. Slowly, hands loose, voice easy. Well, if this is being distributed as an emergency supply, there should be documented testing, right? Bacteria levels, chlorine balance, chemical exposure, liability clearance, standard procedure. Now people were really listening. The teenager stopped filling jugs and looked down into the water like it had personally offended him. A woman holding a bucket lowered it a little. The guy with the hose took one step back. Diana straightened her shoulders and said, the water is perfectly safe. There was a crack in her voice then, tiny but real. I tilted my head and asked, are you certified to verify that? That one landed. You could feel the whole yard pull tight. Because now it wasn't a neighborhood favor, wasn't some heroic drought response. Now it was a liability, illness, responsibility, paper trails, consequences. All the stuff people never think about when they're busy following the loudest person in the room. I glanced at my phone and said, I can call the county health department, make sure we're compliant before anybody takes contaminated recreational water home for public use. That's when the first real retreat happened. The hose got shut off. Somebody set down a container. One of the folding chair people quietly started edging toward the gate. The whole operation had depended on momentum, and momentum just died in the sun. Diana stepped toward me, voice tighter now. That won't be necessary. I nodded like we were in total agreement. I get that. But if this is an officially designated emergency resource, then whoever authorized public distribution would be liable if the water hasn't been properly cleared. I let that breathe a second. Then I opened the shed and reached for the main drain control. That's when her face changed. Not annoyed anymore. Not smug. Alarmed. She snapped, you can't do that. And that right there was the twist of the whole morning. For the first time since barging into my yard, she understood she didn't control the reality she'd created. She only controlled people as long as they believed the story. Once the story cracked, all she had left was volume. I looked right at her and said, better safe than sorry. Then I turned the valve. If you've never heard a pool drain at full release, let me tell you, it is not subtle. It doesn't politely gurgle away. It roars. A deep, heavy rush like the backyard itself has given up holding on. Water tore through the system and out toward the drainage line in one hard, unstoppable surge. For about 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then all hell broke loose. "Stop!" Diana screamed, lunging forward too late. The teenager stared at his half-filled jug like it was now evidence in a criminal case. The guy with the hose let it drop. Somebody actually grabbed their cooler and backed away like the pool might explode. Eric, still leaning over the fence, nearly spilled his coffee, laughing. Diana was unraveling in real time now, her polished little public official voice gone completely. "This is destruction of community property." I pulled up the county property record on my phone, turned the screen toward her, and said, calm as church, "Actually, this is registered private property, which means I can drain it, refill it, repaint it, or turn it into a skateboard bowl if I feel like it." Eric barked out a laugh so loud even Diana flinched. He said, "Man, you really just did that." "Yeah, I did. Not out of rage either. That's the part people miss. I wasn't emotional by then. I was precise." She wanted a symbol of control, so I removed the symbol. No pool, no emergency water station, no fake authority, no performance. And the scene 10 minutes later was almost beautiful in its own ridiculous way. The water line dropped fast. Blue shimmer fading, white steps, exposed tile bands drying in the sun. Then more concrete, more hollow echo, more silence. Soon it was just a dry shell with a few puddles at the bottom, and a crowd of embarrassed adults standing around holding empty containers like they'd all just woken up from the same bad group hallucination. Diana stood there gripping that clipboard so hard I thought it might crack. She tried one last time to gather herself, lifted her chin, and said, "You'll be hearing from the board." I nodded and said, "I hope so. I'll be mentioning the trespassing, the signage, the false claims of authority, and the attempt to seize private property under a fabricated directive." That was it. No comeback, no final speech, no megaphone, just the end. She gestured stiffly to what was left of her little operation, and people started filing out one by one, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes, their buckets, the weather, anything except eye contact with me. The whole thing dissolved exactly the way fake power always dissolves, fast, quiet, and deeply embarrassing once reality shows up. When the last car rolled out of my driveway, Eric came around through the side gate, still grinning like Christmas morning. He looked at the empty pool, looked at me, and said, "So, what now?" I looked at the concrete basin, the wet patio, the red fake sign still hanging crooked on my fence, and I shrugged. "Now," I said, "I rebuild it better." And that's the part that stayed with me more than the yelling, more than the absurdity, more than the visual of grown adults lining up in my backyard with buckets because one woman in a safety vest told them to. What stuck with me was how easy it was to start, how little it took. One confident liar, one fake document, one loud voice, and a bunch of decent people too uncomfortable to be the first one to ask, "Wait, is any of this actually real?" That's the bitter little lesson hiding under all this HOA nonsense. Power doesn't always come from law. Sometimes it comes from theater, from posture, from certainty, from people being tired, polite, distracted, conflict avoidant. And if you're not careful, somebody with no real right to control anything can build a whole temporary kingdom out of your hesitation. I also learned something else. Calm is sharper than anger. People think the strongest response is to get louder, meaner, more aggressive. Sometimes it is. But a lot of the time, the better move is to stay steady, understand the rules better than the person faking them, and let their own nonsense collapse under the weight of simple questions. That kind of clarity ruins a bully's day faster than screaming ever will. Because the truth is, Diana didn't lose when I drained the pool. She lost the second she was forced out of performance and into reality. So, yeah, that's the story of how my pool became a community emergency water reserve for about 20 minutes before turning into a dry concrete crater and taking a fake little empire down with it. And honestly, I still laugh every time I picture that red sign zip-tied to my fence like they were annexing a small country. But here's what I want to know from you. When somebody crosses the line wearing a badge they basically made out of confidence and printer ink, what's the right response? Shut it down immediately. Play along until they expose themselves or hit them with consequences so hard they never try it again. Drop your take in the comments, and if you've ever had someone fake authority, weaponize rules, or try to bully you with made-up power, tell your story too. I really want to know where you draw the line between keeping the peace and making sure karma gets a clear shot.